Thank you for joining me here at Killer Bites for another episode. I'm your host, Mack, and today I'm talking about a murder case that happened all the way back in 2007. Imagine two of your best friends have told you they're coming to your birthday party. The time comes, they're nowhere to be seen. On January 6, 2007, Chris and Channon had made plans to attend a friend's birthday party, grab dinner at a local restaurant, and would later make their way to the apartment of one of Shannon's friends to watch a movie. Earlier in the afternoon, Chris went to a friend's apartment to hang out and get ready for the evening. His friend left the apartment while Chris waited for Channon to pick him up in the car. Once she arrived, the two walked to the parking lot, shared a brief hug, and at that point, the horror began. Just then, Chris felt a gun pointed at the back of his head. Four men took Chris and Channon, tied their hands, and forced them into the back of Shannon's SUV. Friends of the couple tried calling and texting both of them, but never received a response. And after some time, they drove over to the apartment complex and found Chris's truck, but Shannon's SUV was nowhere to be found. The next day, Shannon's mother knew something was off because Channon never returned home. Then Shannon's best friend called her mother confused as to why she and Chris never showed up to the party. Lastly, Shannon's boss called to let her know that she never showed up on her shift. Sure, they were both old enough to come and go from their homes whenever they had pleased, but it wasn't like them to just not show up, especially after saying that they would. Dina went into immediate panic mode and called the police. Unfortunately, because both Channon and Chris were adults, the authorities had to wait at least 24 hours before they could officially categorize them as missing. The kidnappers, George Giovanni Detroit Thomas, Latalvis Darnell Rome Cobbins, Lamarcus Deval Slim Davidson, Vanessa Lynn Coleman, Eric Dwayne E. Boyd, tied the couple up and drove off. Lamarcus had rented a small house over on Chipman Street, located in the Cherry Street area. This area was well known as the bad side of town, a high crime area of the city. Once there, they proceeded to commit some of the most disgusting and horrifying acts to both Chris and Channon. They violently took advantage of Chris. At least one of the attackers assaulted him, but there could have been more. They also inserted objects inside of him. Both Chris and Channon endured hours of violent abuse and torture and were horrifically beaten. While any and all assault is horrifying, what Channon went through was beyond what anyone could have imagined. She was tied up, held separate from Chris in another part of the room, and was barely kept alive while they spent hours hurting her. Things escalated even further, if you can imagine. Channon was kept in the bedroom on the north side of the house where Vanessa Coleman watched her, making sure she couldn't escape. Then George, Latalvis, Lamarcus, and Eric took Chris to a nearby railroad track. They forced him to take off all of his clothes except a shirt and a pair of underwear. They took his shoes, tied a dog leash around his neck, and forced him to walk barefoot along the dirt and rubble. When they got Chris to a place they liked, they covered his eyes with a blindfold, gagged him with a sock, tied his hands and feet behind his back, and proceeded to shoot him execution style. They shot him twice, once in the back and another in the head. Somehow Chris was still breathing. After letting him suffer for a short amount of time, they shot him one more time. His third and final time was fatal, severing his brainstem. In an attempt to hide their despicable deed, they took Chris's lifeless body and then they set it on fire. After Chris, the attackers went back to the house where Channon had been kept captive. Assuming they were on a high from their, they proceeded to assault and beat Channon over and over and over again. After hours of intense torture, Shannon's head and groin area lost a lot of blood because of the damaged blood vessels. They didn't stop there though. The attackers decided that Channon should die too, even after pleading and begging to stay alive. In an attempt to get rid of any potential evidence or DNA, they poured bleach down her throat and all over the wounded, bleeding areas of her body. After this, the attackers bound her hands and legs together in a fetal position. Then they tied up her body in strips of bed sheets, wrapping her body over 5 times in trash bags, and one tightly gagging her head and face. Then they threw her body just into a nearby dumpster. While some say that she died during the torture, it's also believed that she died from suffocation, meaning she was alive for everything until the end. After the job was done, Lamarcus left the scene of the crime, but not before swiping a few items from Shannon's card to gift his girlfriend. For example, a phone charger, Shannon's iPod, A teddy bear, shoes, her camera, her purse. They swiped a baseball cap, which belonged to Chris, and multiple photos from the car and proceeded to rip and burn them. Channon and Chris's friends and families were incredibly worried after not hearing from them all night and well into the next day, and neither of them attended the friend's party. The police turned them away, insisting that they needed to search for themselves. So now, we've reached January 7th, and around noon, a railroad worker patrolling the area stumbled upon Chris's body. It was obvious that something sinister had occurred. His body was still smoking and was covered from head to toe in burns, bruises, cuts, and battered bare feet. Authorities were called, and Chris's body was wrapped in a comforter to hide his extensive injuries. Shannon's family took matters into their own hands and started to search for her. While using the tracking connected to her cell phone, they were able to find her vehicle abandoned near Chipman Street. They managed to get into her car and notice how disheveled everything was. Channon was known to keep her car in pristine condition. It was covered in mud. The seats pushed back all the way, multiple items missing, a pack of cigarettes Channon didn't smoke, and even stickers on the back of her car that had been removed. So much was out of pocket. The police were able to take fingerprints from a piece of paper inside the car and matched it to Lamarcus Davidson. Lamarcus had a very long run-in with the law and was known to carjack around the area, and had just been released from prison. They were able to track his name to a rental home near Cherry Street. Shannon's body wasn't discovered until January 9th, 2 days after Chris's. She was found dumped in a dumpster at 2316 Chipman Street, which was only 2 blocks away from where her car was abandoned. DNA from multiple attackers was found on and in Shannon's body and clothing, matching them to Lamarcus. They were directed to the rental house, where they found footprints matching the attackers, as well as shell casings from the gun used to execute Chris. On January 11th, the police visited the rental property and found Lamarcus where he was arrested. When brought into the station, Lamarcus went on to tell several lies, changing a story about where he was, what had happened that night, and if he was or wasn't involved with the kidnapping and murders. That same day in Lebanon, Kentucky, George Thomas, Latalvis Cobbins, and Vanessa Coleman were arrested. After the public heard about these atrocities, various white supremacist groups protested and tried to say that these were racially motivated. Since the were black and the victims were white, these groups used this as an example to fuel their disgusting agenda. The white supremacists were met with a lot of opposition. It was shown that while the kidnapping was awful, it was not racially motivated. Channon and Chris were not specifically targeted because of the color of their skin, it was just random. The first of the trials didn't begin until April of 2008, and since there were multiple attackers, the process was going to be lengthy and difficult. Eric Boyd was found guilty of being an accessory to carjacking and failing to report a fugitive. As he explained, he knew what happened but refused to get involved. He wasn't charged with murder, but he was the first of the attackers to be sentenced to 18 years in prison. Later that same year, the rental property where Channon and Chris endured their torture was thankfully demolished. The people didn't want a constant reminder of the horrors that the town had seen. In August of 2009, Latalvis Cobbins was convicted of first-degree murder and was found guilty of both Channon and Chris's murders. He was acquitted of taking part in the rape of Channon. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Good riddance later, bro. In October of 2009, Lamarcus Davidson was convicted on counts of first-degree murder, first-degree felony murder, and facilitation of aggravated rape. Originally, there was an uproar, begging for the death penalty. He was eventually sentenced to 80 years in prison. In December of 2009, George Thomas was found guilty of more than 12 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In May of 2010, Vanessa Coleman finally faced trial. She was found not guilty in relation to Chris's death. However, she was convicted of murder, kidnapping, rape, and theft of Channon. She was sentenced to 53 years in prison. In memory of Channon, a foundation and memorial golf tournament were created in her name. This foundation gives a scholarship to Shannon's alma mater of Farragut for those who wish to attend the University of Tennessee. For Chris, a memorial baseball tournament is held where a scholarship is given in his name to a member of the Halls High School baseball team. This is one of the harder cases that I've covered, personally. While none of them are easy to hear, reading about the indescribable torture Channon and Chris had to endure is so, how do you say, gruesome? They were so young, and innocent, and I can't imagine being a friend or a loved one hearing what truly happened that night. That's all I have for today's case. What are your thoughts on this one? Until next time, I'm your host, Mac. Stay safe out there.